Closing of the American Mind, Chapter 2 summary. In this chapter, I found out how little I know about the world, and he just tore me a new arse. And we'll go over it in a summary, and you will probably feel as regretful as I did.
Yeah. So what Bloom did, so in this particular chapter, it's a shorter chapter. Bloom talks about books, and Josh, don't feel bad. When I first read this chapter, I was like, oh, ooh, ooh, I have been somewhat negligent in my education. I have been somewhat negligent, but so the big things there are two quotes that I wanted to pull out, and then three questions that Bloom asked that I think will be really really good to let people know about. So here's quote number one: literature is critical because it presents to young people the range of possibilities of human types, both the good and the bad. And this goes back to a theme that I talk about, and I think I cannot think of a better way to describe it than using the theme at the gym. Like, let's say, one wants to improve their physique or their physical fitness. You can look at, like a Greek statue or Roman statue, or just, open up, a fashion magazine and look at the models. You can get a very clear idea of what a virtuous body would look like, in the sense that, somebody looks good, or, I want to look like that one day, whatever. It's instinctive. It's built into us as humans. And I think what Bloom's trying to say, going back to this quote right here, is that if you don't have a similar mechanism to show people, particularly when they're young and in their formative years, what a good, well, Bloom would use the word soul, but maybe you could use the term like, psyche, or, the way to think about world, the way to understand archetypes, et cetera, which we'll get into in a later chapter where Bloom talks a lot about that. That, I think, is what Bloom is really trying to say. I think what he's really trying to lament. And so, to your point, this is where Bloom was talking about, the old great books tradition. And without knowing the archetypes, the themes, the concepts from this, it becomes much harder for the individual, especially the young developing individual, to kind of understand what the range of possibilities are.
Right. This,
So,
this comes to the first question that he asked. He was basically
yeah.
like, books have really impacted your life the most. And he's saying, well, some of my students would go and say Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead. And I was thinking, that's what I would say, except I'd say Atlas Shrugged. And he's just showing the illiteracy and the negligence of these books.
I think Bloom's exact quote is, "A book, although hardly literature,"
Yeah.
is what Bloom. So,
It's just he's saying that
yeah.
these students, they have such a lack of knowledge of the great literatures, and
Yeah.
it lacks more of compass, because if you don't know what people think, you don't know right from wrong, and you think you do.
Maybe one was thing is that when you have, the books, and you have the possibilities, your vision expands, and the bad, right? But if you don't have, that this range, like the Overton, I think it would be the Overton window, might be wrong on that. It becomes very, very narrow. Hence, the mind closes, where people can only see a very, very narrow part of it. And because, like, they're not looking beyond, this vision, because their vision's been enfeebled, they're blinded to many things. They lack the perception of the heights. They lack the perception of the depths, for better or for worse, probably for worse in this
Yeah.
particular
It's kind
scenario.
of like going to an education system and just learning about, let's say you just learn about US history, and all you hear is the US perspective of history your whole life, and therefore you believe that as fact. But
Yeah.
then maybe you take a class on the Japanese version of history, and you say, what is this? This is completely different from everything that I've learned. It's because you lack the perspectives of other people. And through reading these great literature and just books in general, you are widening your perspective to see the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, and one other thing on that point too is that, like, so Bloom also talks in the prior chapter when he first started, the blank slate. He says that, or he makes the comment that when he was going through school, the interpretation that his professors gave him basically had the effect of encouraging the student body to hate the founding. And it's true that, the founders of America, sure, they had their faults, but they also had their strengths. And by having, an understanding of both the good and the bad, you're able to see a much more accurate version of what it is, and I think able to understand it. But if you only see like one side, only hear one side, information is distorted with intent. You lack the ability to form your own thoughts, so it's not a good situation. But yeah.
Yeah.
So the second question that he asked is, so, back up. So just a bit of history. So, like, Bloom says, like, listen, when I got students, I would ask them this question, like, who, the one we just said, what books have you read?
No, he would
But
say books have really influenced your life.
oh yeah. Like, what books actually mean something to you? Not that you've read, but like that you read and you took seriously. It's like, oh, this is something that I need to, like, integrate into my psyche. So anyways, Bloom was disappointed with the answer of that. So then he started asking a second question, which was this one, like, who are your heroes? In other words, like, who do you look up to? Like, who, maybe as Bloom might say it, like, who would you, or what would you use to furnish your soul? So again, going back to my gym analogy, if somebody is, let's say a guy, for example, is trying to, develop, like upper body or whatever, right? They might look to, let's say, like, maybe someone else at the gym who's done a good job, or, a statue or whatever, say, like that form is what I want to get to. I might not be able to get to there exactly, but I've got something that where I can like orient myself and like strive towards that. So same concept, like who would you the student, right, view as like a role model or someone that would inspire you, someone you could say, I want to be like that, even if I can't be, even if I never get there, I at least want to try to push myself to get there.
Yeah, and he basically said his students had no answer. They would say, well, we don't have heroes. And I would
Oh,
consider
yep.
myself in the same category as that. That is what I would have said, but I put a lot of thought into these questions after thinking about it, and now I've reshaped my thinking. And because you go to the gym and you see someone, holy smokes, that person has the ideal body. I would love to look like that. So why can't I pursue it the way that they are?
Yeah. And I will say that before we get to the third question, Bloom also said, one of the other questions, like the typical questions, as a professor of political philosophy, there's kind of the usual questions they would go for, is that students would come to him completely enamored with moral relativism. I would view moral relativism as the wages that Yuri Bezdomov's demoralization would produce. But the point is that Bloom would ask his students, okay, well, listen, if you're going to say like all ways are equal or no way or like no culture is superior to another culture, suppose, let's say my dear students, who think everything is relative, if you were a British administrator in India, would you let the locals burn? Because this is what would happen. Like they would throw the widow of the deceased onto the deceased funeral pyre, effectively killing the widow. Like, would you have allowed this practice to continue? The implication being that if you being the British administrator, stepped in and said, no, you can't do that, you're making a moral judgment. You're saying, listen, even though that might be a local tradition, we find it repugnant to the point where we are going to say our culture in this particular area is superior and we will not let it happen. So the point is you're trying to force, you're kind of putting, the philosophical gun to someone's head and forcing them to, see it. And even then, like the students have a good answer. They would just kind of like, do the, like, well, we shouldn't have been there in the first place, or some cop out. They wouldn't address the question head on and say, well, okay, fine.
And I think of it kind of like today. Like, let's say we go back to times where people had slaves. Everyone says slaves were so bad. I would have been standing up fighting for the freedoms of these slaves. No, you wouldn't. This is happening right now with the COVID. People are forcefully quitting, like being forced to not go on. They can't travel. They can't be a human. In some countries like Australia, you're literally being put into a quarantine camp.
We've done that before, but not in Australia.
The exact same thing is happening, but nobody cares. And they think that they would do the opposite in the past, but they're not doing the same today. It's the same themes, and nobody is standing up for what they actually believe in because they don't have that moral compass.
Yeah.
And
when I was
a relativism, or they are like demoralized from what Bloom. I mean, what
Bezdomov. Yeah. See, so the thing is, like Bezdomov and Bloom, they're saying the same thing. They're coming at it from different angles, but they're saying the same thing. If you can put the patterns together.
This weekend, marching for freedom. This is not just putting it up there.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say too, one other thing. In this regard, I was like, when I was a little boy, my parents would always say, Justin, if everyone would jump off a cliff, would you jump off a cliff? Implying that you'd be clever enough not to follow the herd off to the cliff. Well, the corollary to that is that imagine how strange you would look if you chose not to jump off the cliff, as everyone else stampeded by you. They might say, you idiots, surely we can't all be this stupid. Do you think we're all jumping to our death? Like, imagine the insults, and imagine the strength of character and the integrity of one's moral compass you would need to resist the consensus monster. So another quip from Bloom, by the way, that's where I get that from, the consensus monster. Bloom, we'll back up a later chapter where Bloom talks about TV, and Bloom is a very direct, bordering on frank, going on that. But yeah, it's all in good time. So anyways, Josh, yeah, the third question was, so basically Bloom was frustrated, or not frustrated, but I get the sense he was disappointed when he asked the students the first two questions. He said, fine, screw it or whatever, right? We'll ask a third question. Who's evil? And generally, the first response he got to that one was, well, Hitler. And I'm like, oh, okay, I guess.
Classic answer. If anybody asked me that question, I would say the exact same thing. But then he goes
beyond
on.
That, yeah, because beyond that, who else? And then like some students would say, well, I mean, maybe Nixon. And remember, this is like circa late 70s, early 80s is when I think this was Bloom was doing this. And even Bloom says, well, Nixon was like at the time was slowly being rehabilitated. The image was being cleaned up. But the point was like students really didn't know. beyond just the flagship thing of what was evil. And I see this as all as or I suspect Bloom is throwing this out there to put up evidence of his point that students, they do not have heroes, so they can't look up to say, okay, this is what we should be. Or, the villains to say, okay, well, wait a minute, these are some really bad examples that we shouldn't be. Says, when he pushes his students to try to find an answer, the general response that he would get, at least is what I understand him, was that the students would kind of say, well, everyone's kind of good because nobody's really kind of evil. I mean, sure, there's evil deeds, but nobody's really evil. I mean, if only they got the right therapy, maybe that would clear things up. And so it gets back to this thing where when you play with relativism, like, you've got to be really, really careful. And there's probably a time and a place for it, but like, complete relativism is a problem because it distorts the soul, or it distorts the mind's ability to, what I would say, is see true north, like lock on to a point and say, this is good. And because this is good over here, that's bad, for example, over there. You're making a value judgment. You're putting yourself on the line. You're basically saying, I'm not going to throw myself off the cliff because that's certain too. But I don't care that everyone else is doing it. I'm not going to do it. There's that.
That was pretty much the chapter. And what I really took away was that if I was in Bloom's class during this time, I would be the exact person that he hated. But what I do think is that I would be able to find myself through his teachings and hopefully want to learn. Because after reading this book, I started reading other books, and now I'm multitasking, reading a few books and learning as much as possible because I want to understand, and I don't want to be one of those the stereotypes that he's relaying here, because I know that I would have a better grasp of the world if I did.
I've seen my wicked ways. Yeah, I would say too.
Like, just as like, you can see what's right. This guy Bloom has an incredible soul and mental and like capacity that I want to strive for. And I'm going to take a lot of steps that he suggests in the book.
Yeah. Josh, one last thing. I don't know if it says in this chapter. I think it's maybe the next one. We're just about to come up. We haven't come up on it. He says that he gets a letter from, or he received a letter from one of his students who had since graduated and had gone on to the world. And basically the student said, like, Professor Bloom, you are not a professor of political science. You are a travel agent. In other words, implying that Bloom had given the student, in reference, the ability to understand the highs, the lows, and whatnot. So when the student actually got to, Europe in this particular situation, to go around and see, all the old historical places, they have the context. They have the context and the like the lens of their soul to actually see what was really going on and appreciate it for what it was, versus just the surface level. And Bloom's response was, nothing could have pleased me more. That's exactly what I was trying to do. So
yes. All right, guys, this was chapter 2. I highly recommend picking up the book.